I'm a man of few words, and here with me is a man of only one word, Sjón. Voor mijn applaus. Okay, so Sjón, when you are on tour, for example in France, England, or Germany, they say, Mr. Sjón, our king, president, or chancellor, sends you his regards. Not in Slovenia. In Slovenia, we say, Slavoj Žižek sends you his regards. I talked with him. I told him I'm hosting you today in Ukraine, and he said, send him my regards. He's a great guy. He never said that about me. Never. So you must be very important. So we, Slovenes, used to be you, Icelanders. Slovenia used to be Iceland. Everybody loved us, so small, so cool, so cute, so non-threatening. How come such a small country is having so many Olympic medalists, How come they qualify to World Cup, to Euro Cup, and so on? Now, that's you. That's you. Yeah, you're now what we used to be. You, for example, you Icelanders even did something totally unbelievable. In Iceland, there's practically no murders, okay? But you sold your country as a capital of crime fiction.
Yeah.
Yeah, so, sorry, yeah,
Thank you.
Yeah.
And please return my regards to.
Yeah, okay.
Yes, maybe we used to be you. And maybe you used to be us. How was it? At least I come from a country that is smaller than yours. And a country that has been for a long time, I think, punching above its weight. And yes, we finally became a member of the soccer family of the world by making it to the European finals and things like that. And that is new.
Yeah.
Because our currency, when we go into the big world, has always been literature and culture and music until the footballers came along. I don't know if it's a good thing, but I'm glad to be here as a writer and not a soccer player.
But then again, how did you manage to sell Iceland as a capital of crime fiction? Because, by the way, your crime writers are global super sellers. Arnaldur Indriðason, Yrsa Sigurðardóttir, Ragnar Jónasson, Lilja Sigurðardóttir, Eva Björk Asgidóttir, Solveig Pálsdóttir. Why don't they have short name like you? I don't.
Yes, you're right. The biggest selling authors from Iceland are crime writers, and especially Arnaldur Indriðason, who has sold 100 million copies of his crime novels. And maybe the reason people are interested in Icelandic murder stories from a country where no murder really happened, is that they think, at least there is something bad in this place. And it's not only making wonderful music and films and writing, poetry and things like that. Maybe they are secretly murdering one another all the time, and they have city lives and big problems. It can be comforting to people who are envious of us.
But you are fantasizing about crimes, about murders. And fantasy is better than facts, obviously. You are collective, Karl May.
Yeah, it seems to work. But this is a formula that came from Sweden. Yeah. And the Swedes, of course, have more murders than we do. But they are really at the same time more comfortable than we are, So they came up with this formula. And Arnaldur, he used it in Iceland, and it worked, It is a very peaceful place, and maybe we are embarrassed about how peaceful it is. And we want to be a part of the big dark world too. I don't know. You know, in 2008, when the financial crash happened in Iceland, that is practically the only time in history that we have been the bad guys in anything. Because people in Germany and the Netherlands and England and other places, they lost a lot of money, their pensions, because of what the Icelandic economical bandits did. So that's the only time in history that we have really been the bad guys. And I can say that we really didn't like it. You know, when we were abroad and people were like, you know, actually for at least for a year after the crash, if an Icelander, if people in Paris realized, okay, there's a group of Icelanders there at the table, you know, they wouldn't serve them. We were really bad, you know, we were really the villains. And that was a new experience for us. But then we just continued with the music and the poetry and all of that.
Well, speaking about short pen names, when did you adopt your pen name, Sjón?
So Sjón is an abbreviation of my real name. My real name is Sigurjón Birkir Sigurðsson.
Could you repeat?
Sigurjón Birkir Sigurðsson. Now you all know it by heart. And when I started writing, which was 45 years ago, when I was 15, turning 16 in 1978, I realized that I had that something had happened to me. Poetry had happened to me. I had started writing poetry, and I somehow got the idea that I should actually publish my poetry. I should publish a book of poetry. And I remember sitting there in my room in the suburbs of Reykjavik, where I lived with my mother at the time, and thinking, it's a big thing, you know, to be a poet. What can I do? I felt quite exposed. So I realized that I could do a little trick with my name. So if you take Sigurjón and you take the middle out of Sigurjón, you have the name Sjón. And Sjón means vision in Icelandic and sight. And one of the things that I had discovered at the time in poetry was that poetry was really a visual art. That the poets were brilliant at making images and strays, pictures with words.
Eyes of the world.
And I became the eyes of the world by being Sjón, you know. So maybe not a very humble statement from a 15-year-old, but, you know, I thought I will be the eyes of the world. So I became Sjón, and I published my first book in the summer of 1978. I didn't have a clue what to do, really. I all of a sudden just had boxes in my room with 100 copies of this book of poetry. So I had to start like getting rid of them. And I of course knew that books were sold in bookstores because I had been buying books. So I went to the 2 or 3 of the biggest bookstores in Reykjavik and came there with my books. And people were like, what is this teenager doing here with these books? And I said, well, this is my book of poetry. And they were very helpful and showed me all the things I needed to do, invoices and things like that. But then I discovered that I could sell it on the bus. So whenever I had to go from Breiðholt, where I lived, it was like a 20 minutes drive, and go from there to the center of the city where I was working in the gardens of the city hospital, I could sell it on the way. So I just walked around the bus and sold the book. Sometimes I gave the book to people who said, take a look. But they said no, of course, immediately. And I said, take a look at it. And I sold quite a number of books on the bus in Reykjavik. So that was my first experience of touring with my work.
Okay, but is being a poet or a writer a role? Changing your name made it possible for you to be a poet, a writer? I mean, in a sense, David Bowie, your idol, was doing the same thing. He was constantly engaging new roles, new mutations, and so on. As you were once upon a time also Ginny Triumph.
Yeah, you know, I discovered there that being a poet was a role. You're right; it's a role. It's you place yourself in a specific place in society. Mm-hmm. You put yourself into a specific place, and obviously, being a 16-year-old poet was not something that made the news, because people were used to Icelanders just saying, okay, now I am a poet too, and just publishing a book and stepping forward. But I was quite on the young side, I must say. And actually, one of my idols in poetry, Einar Bragi, who was one of the atom poets, so-called, that came forward in Iceland after the Second World War. Icelandic poetry changed overnight almost in 1948 when 2 books were published, which were the first modernist, surrealist books of poetry published in Iceland. And this was a small group of people who were influenced by Swedish and French surrealism mostly, who founded like a small group called the Atom Poets. And my family had ties with Einar Bragi, this writer who had been the editor of their incredibly influential literary magazine and cultural magazine. When I actually went to the offices of the Writers' Union, I thought I needed to register my book or something, so I took the book there. And when I was there, Einar Bragi came to the office of the Writers' Union, and he just looked at me and said, "You're a very courageous young boy. Publishing poetry is not easy." And then I knew it was not easy. It was not only dancing on roses, but this was the biggest compliment he could give me.
Yeah, there is impression that all Icelanders are artists, writers, filmmakers, musicians, composers of film soundtracks, dancers. So who's fishing? Who's whaling?
You know, it's right. It's a bit like I have been told that the Bali is, because the people of Bali, they are always preparing the next big religious festival, the next big religious parade, and the whole society is somehow always just preparing for that. But at the same time, they manage to live and feed themselves and run the society. And in a way, in Iceland, we are always just like writing the next book and all of that, you know, composing the next string quartet or organizing the next art exhibition or making the next film. And in a way, you know, I think there is a consensus in the society that we need art, we need culture, that we would be nothing without culture. So it is seen as a collaborative effort, you know. So the person who is fishing is contributing to the next book of poetry by taking care of that, you know, that part of it, you know. But in general, Icelandic society is very welcoming to people who want to try their hands at this. So in my case, you know, my mother, you know, she was a little bit surprised when her 15-year-old teenage son said, okay, I'm going to use a part of my salary from the gardening at the hospital to pay for this book of poetry. She was a bit surprised, but she was like, okay, let him try it, you know. It's maybe better that he tries this than some of the other things that kids are trying. And the consensus is that if somebody wants to make a CD or open an exhibition or whatever, yeah, let him try it, or let her try it, you know, because the worst thing that can come out of it is that when the person turns 50, that they will talk about it at the 50th birthday party to embarrass the person and say, you published a book of poetry when you were 16, you know. And that's the worst thing that can happen to you, that somebody thinks it's funny like 40 years later.
How this Icelandic cultural tsunami came about?
I think it came about because of this. Something happened in the 80s with my generation, and on the society level, what happened was that we were the first group of artists that broke the
Cold War.
The cold. We broke the rules of the Cold War that was dominant in Icelandic culture. The Cold War was really fast in Iceland. You know, we have this American NATO base, and a part of the population was practically split in half when it came to the NATO base. People were against it or people were for it. And then we had like a very strong cultural activity on the left. There was a strong literary magazine founded by the people from the first Communist Party and the Socialist Party, who also had a very active publishing house. We had a publishing house on the right, from the conservative people and all of that. But my generation, we were so lucky that punk happened. And the Sex Pistols released the song Anarchy in the UK. And all of a sudden, a lot of people just learned that there was something called anarchism. We really didn't know what it was. But we could say, when people asked us, are you on the left or are you on the right? We could say, no, we're anarchists. And they thought, what is that? You know, that's just something silly. That's utopia. And we said, good, then we take care of that. So I think what happened was that when we broke the rules, these rules of the cultural community in Iceland, by refusing to take sides on the left or the right, something happened. We opened some floodgates. We became independent from that. And that's when all of the music started flowing, all the strange poetry, the young filmmakers started coming through and all of that. So it was a political...
It came as a release. It came as a release, like Renaissance after Middle Ages.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, but...
a little bit smaller.
Yeah. But, General John Hackett, he used to be big thing in the NATO. In 1982, he published a novel, Third World War, in which Third World War starts in Slovenia because of Slovenian separation from Yugoslavia. So Slovenia was ultimate battleground by Russia and America. So was Iceland. In 1972, there was in Reykjavik a chess match, Bobby Fischer versus Boris Spassky. It was final battle between America and Russia, good and bad, West, East, capitalism, communism. That was a Third World War on chessboard.
Absolutely. And I was 10 years old, and I remember it very well because this was like the biggest thing that had ever happened in Icelandic society.
Rocky IV, Avon Letter. Rocky versus Ivan Drago.
Yeah. No, this was very, 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 very political. And actually, I think what happened there was concluded in the meeting of Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev in 86, if I remember correctly. So we were like, you know, this playground for the Cold War in many ways, and we had the NATO military base monitoring the North Atlantic. We had the Russian submarines all around the country. We were very much aware of this, and like we were very much aware of this situation. And was there a question, or how was it? Were we just discussing the Cold War?
Yeah, Cold War.
Yeah, and so it's symbolic as well, as you say. The chess match was symbolic, and there was something that I thought when you were talking about that. You said something.
I had you. After this release, after this cultural revolution, what did you say? Like Fukuyama, this is end of history, this is it. It will be like that for next 30 years, 40, 50, forever.
Well, I mean, we were, when we started our cultural revolution and miniature renaissance in Iceland, we were just trying to shake things up and have fun. Because we felt that Reykjavik in the 70s, the Reykjavik that we had grown up in, had to be the most boring place on earth, and something had to be done about it, you know. So our politics were always done in a non-political language, you know. We refused we refused the dialogue of the politicians, and that was one of the things that helped us break through, because we refused to take part in the conversation on the terms of the politicians and the political sides. And this is something that came to what would you say, that this attitude, this anarchist, surrealist, punk attitude that we had in the 80s when it came to culture, it actually merged with politics in 2010, when one of the punk poets of Reykjavik, Sjón, who was like a punk surrealist poet, who had affiliations with Bad Taste, which was the record label of the Sugar Cubes, and also a publishing house. When Sjón decided in 2010 to run for mayor in Reykjavik, he enlisted people from this group. So he ran, and he founded a party called the Best Party, and the Best Party was made up of people from the cultural underground of the 80s. And what happened was that we won the election. Sjón became the mayor of Reykjavik for 4 years. And we ran the city of Reykjavik for 4 years. Yeah. And how did we do it? Sjón, he set the line. You know, he was the brain behind this political action. He said, our politics are anarcho-surrealism. So we can never say a word they understand in any political discussions on television or anywhere. So he just went on television. He went he did meetings, like open meetings with the leaders of the other political parties, and he just spoke nonsense. You know, he said, in the future we will use whales to travel from Iceland to Europe and the Americas and things like that. And they said, but what are you going to do for Reykjavik? Oh yes, we're going to bring polar bears into the city zoo, which is mostly like domestic animals. And he just said things like that, you know. And we all said things like that. Reykjavik needs squirrels. There are no squirrels in Reykjavik. And the man became the mayor of Reykjavik, and we won the election on refusing to speak in the language of politics. So for 4 years, Reykjavik, I think it's the only city in history that has been run by anarcho-surrealists. So we did.
But would you say that this cultural tsunami, this cultural revolution transformed country? That this progressive revolution changed the country into more progressive country?
You know, Iceland is not as boring as it was in the 70s. That's the answer to it. You know, so something happened. You know, I was a member of
internet came.
I was a member of a small group of surrealists called Medusa, and we obviously had the aim of bringing surreality to Iceland, to make Iceland surreal. And one of my friends who was not in the group, he said to me a few years ago, "It sounds like you succeeded." And I said, "Why do you say that?" He said, "You know, I was watching a broadcast from the parliament, and I can't remember what they were talking about. But a member of parliament after another said, what the last honorable speaker said was completely surreal." You know, so they started using this word surreal about, you know, everything they were doing in the parliament, and so it seems that we won.
But there is a cool irony here. You know, Icelandic language is spoken by few. Yes. That's a fact. But Iceland is culturally everywhere, all over the world. And Icelandic culture is shaping the world, and your novels are exactly about opposite, how great world history is shaping Iceland.
Yes, I think no one in Iceland has the answer for why Icelandic culture is everywhere. No, we don't know. The only thing we know is that we just go forward with whatever we need to do at every given time, And one thing we have is courage and an absolute will not to compromise, And I think this comes from the size of the country and size of the community, that we just do what we need to do. We can never worry about how the big world will react to what we do. Mm. And you're right. I mean, we are obviously influenced by what happens in the big world, and have for a long time. But at the same time, we have like the mentality that, we're just here, we're making our things, And sometimes we take them out into the big world. And we have the confidence of seeing every culture everywhere in the world at whatever given time in history, we see it as unequal, And that comes from the incredible confidence we have in ourselves, simply because of the fact that these amazing prose narratives called the sagas were written in Iceland in the medieval times. And from that we got this strange idea that we are a cultural powerhouse in the history of the world. And obviously this is megalomania, but it's very helpful when you're from a small place.
Yeah, but being from small country, from periphery, is not bad. It gives you a unique perspective. Everything is for the taking. I mean, you can choose. You can take from France, you can take surrealism. From United States, you can take that. From Slovenia, you can take Žižek.
Yes, you can pick and choose if you're just being there, like on the edge of civilization or north of war, as we say. Yeah.
I hear even better. I hear you can be a thing like the world is a Tinder for you. You can swipe. This, yes, this, no.
Yeah, we try many things. Some things work, some things don't. And and actually, what has happened over and over is that we pick and choose from world cultures, and we pick and choose from the big power centers of the world. And we take it to our place, and we just mess around with it until something happens. And then we go back into the big world and say, look what happened, look what happened to this stuff. And they are so blasé, that they don't even recognize that we've taken something of theirs and turned it into something new. But that's what we're doing all the time. And this is like, this is the privilege of living on the periphery, Yeah. There is so much strength in it.
Yeah.
And you know this, of course, here in Slovenia, and being in a place where you can pick and choose.
Every small country is having its literary god, who's throwing shadows on all other writers, future, present, and past. So we have Ivan Cankar. You have Nobel Prize winner Halldór Laxness. How did you cope with him?
Well, Halldór Laxness won the Nobel Prize in 1955, and that was obviously a huge moment for Icelandic culture and Icelandic literature. Before that, we had the sagas. And the sagas were already out there in the big world, influencing Latin American literature, influencing film noir in the United States through Dashiell Hammett, who couldn't read enough, of the sagas, and so forth and so forth. And then Halldór Laxness comes, and he becomes obviously this giant god of Icelandic literature. And that is what I grow up with. But I found my own way with Halldór Laxness. I never felt cold in his shadow, I found my own way to his works, And what I did was that I used the fact that he had actually been interested in surrealism for a short while, for three years, in the 20s. He was interested in surrealism. And I looked at what he was doing there at that time, and I found traces of it in everything that he had done since. So I could actually work with a lot of the things that he had offered us in tools of literature. And obviously I think most smaller countries have these giants, and you just have to make them your own, and you have to drag them into our contemporary times, like I think you did with your man.
Yes, you must find craziness in the yes, because we always can relate to craziness, because we always think that we live in crazy times, and actually we live in crazy times. But there was a lot of collaboration with Nazis during Second World War in Slovenia, but not in Iceland. However, after Second World War, in late 50s, there were no neo-Nazis in Slovenia, but they were on Iceland. I'm referring here at your great novel, The Red Milk, but it is based on true story about a very young man who on Iceland in late 50s founded neo-Nazi party. I mean, of all the gin joints in all towns in all the world, on Iceland.
Yes. What can I say? A virus can hide, in a dark, remote place, Some years ago, they were actually looking for the virus that caused the Spanish influenza. The virus has never been found. The actual virus that caused the Spanish influenza has never been found. But some years ago, they were looking for it in Svalbard because there were people who had died from the Spanish influenza in Svalbard, and they thought they might have still that the virus had survived in the frozen graves of Svalbard. It hadn't, but it tells you that the viruses can survive in different remote places. And obviously, in this book that you're referring to, Red Milk, I'm talking about a young man who, after the Second World War, becomes infected with the virus of Nazism that survives in the small society, in the silence around Nazism. So, again, looking at what happens when ideas fester or are fostered in this remote place.
But the interesting thing is this. We're watching him growing up, and we're looking for potential signs, tells, symptoms, clues, triggers. Nada, nothing. There's even no Nordic symbols, no Vikings or heroes from your sagas, which are dear to neo-Nazis. So what is a trigger? Obviously, trigger is his normality.
Yes, the book is written with an inspiration, obviously, from Hannah Arendt's concept of banality, of evil, So I was working with that. And now that we mentioned this book, I think in all my books, I am always dealing with the relationship of this small island with the rest of the world. Things coming to the island, because that is the nature of islands. That is the nature of, obviously, all places that border the sea, that things are drift on shore, But Iceland was settled in the 9th century, so we came there on ships, and we know that we can leave and come back and get stuff. And maybe this is the cultural heritage of the Vikings, actually, that we just go into the world, we come back with stuff, and we keep it there, So it's like a pirate's treasure that we have there and that we can work with. And sometimes it's good, and sometimes it's bad,
But these small, pathetic neo-Nazi underground parties and groups from 50s you are mentioning, Red Milk, are the very roots and very seeds of today's far-right, alt-right, identitarian, true white nationalist supremacy movement.
in Iceland and in Sweden, there was no reckoning after the Second World War when it came to the Nazi parties that had been in those countries. And Sweden actually has the what you can say, what happened in Sweden was that the neo-Nazis in Sweden, they inspired the Icelandic people. And the neo-Nazi movement as we know it today was more or less founded on the ideology that the Swedes came up with, because they were never taken to task, the Nazis in Sweden, for their support of that ideology, because Sweden was neutral. And this happened. But then the crazy thing is with Iceland is that, as you know, Iceland has the tendency to be in the news. It's very strange. Why is this country in the news all the time? We don't know. It seems to be something about this country that puts it in the news all over the globe once in a while. There is a volcanic eruption. There's a financial crash. There was like the Fischer-Spassky, Reagan Gorbachev. There are always like news coming from this island, and it seems to be destined. If we can use the word destiny. At the same time, we're talking about Nazis and things like that. I'm not sure, but I'll use it. It seems that the country is destined to be some kind of crossroads. And the strange thing about this story that I told in Red Milk is that one of the ideological founders of the neo-Nazi movement, Savitri Devi, she came to Iceland when she was a persona non grata in Europe. She came to Iceland. George Lincoln Rockwell, who's the founder of the American Nazi Party and founded the white supremacist movement in the United States, he was married to an Icelandic woman. So he was in Iceland. So it was so strange for me when I started researching the story of this young man that he was directly tied in to this history. It was not just some lonely guy with strange ideas in Reykjavik in the 50s, He was in an active conversation with these people, And one of the things that I used when I was writing the book was the fact that I, as a teenager in Reykjavik, I was corresponding with people all over the world. I was corresponding with surrealists and surrealist groups all over the world. And when I finally went to France and England and to meet some of these people, they were just shocked when they realized that they had been corresponding with teenagers. They had no clue, So we somehow have this tendency of just plugging in. And when I came to France, of course, I stayed with the widow of André Breton, Of course, you always go just directly to the top if you're an Icelandic poet, Poetry was one of our main exports in the medieval times, Icelandic poets traveled to the courts of the Nordic countries and England and Scotland and delivered poetry. It was the most expensive export, the richest export we had. It was poetry. And when you came to a new place, you always said, I need to speak to the king because I'm a poet and I've got a poem to recite.
Well, but at the time, in 50s, all those small neo-Nazi groups, they were dead end, They look like dead end, like cul-de-sac. They were on the fringe. But look at them today. They're still dead end. They're still cul-de-sac, but they're not on fringe anymore.
No, nobody would have believed it. But in 1962, when they founded the World Union of National Socialists, it was like a group of eccentrics in shorts and doing the salutes and whatever in the cocktails in England, and now they are all over. So what can we do? I mean, one of the things that I propose is that we admit that nothing is clean, that nothing is pure in culture or human society. We thrive because we are never pure. We are never clean. The Chinese obviously have a saying for it. And then they use it actually for corruption. When Chinese authorities are asked about corruption, they confess that they have their big crackdowns on corruption once in a while, where they take a lot of people and they just execute them to show people that corruption is bad. But they also believe that little corruption is always needed, to keep things moving. And they say, no fish lives in clear water. You can't survive in clear water. Nothing survives where things are clear. And the novel, CoDex 1962, is an attempt at creating a novel that is made up of so many different things that you can't say it's one specific thing. It is a statement that culture is always made up of bric-a-brac meeting cathedrals. We have the cathedrals of the cultural history and literary history, but we also have the pulp novels. We also have the dirty jokes. We also have the lullabies, and all of this makes human culture. Human culture has never been clean or pure or homogeneous. And the Icelanders have never been homogeneous. We have always been made up of all the different people that came to the island. And you might think, okay, but it was only the Norwegians and maybe a few Irish. No. When they finally mapped out the Icelandic genome, they found it was incredibly complex, as all human genomes are. So let's fight Nazism by celebrating what's unclean.
Yeah, but it's a problem, because if you ask far-right people, they are not far-right people or fascists. They consider themselves as people who think logically, rationally. They think of themselves as voice of reason. But before we go to CoDex,
so let's fight reason.
Yeah, perfect. But before we go to CoDex, I just ask you something. Do you know that you have a Slovenian character in red milk?
I mentioned her. Yeah.
On your list of Jews that escaped to Iceland during the Second World War, there is someone called Urbančič. And Urbančič is purely, eminently Slovenian surname. So,
yes.
Yeah. But by the way, I said there's no Nordic symbols or heroes from Icelandic sagas in red milk, but your novel, Whispering Muse, opens with this line. I, Valdimar Haraldsson, was in my 27th year when I embarked on the publication of a small journal devoted to my chief preoccupation, the link between fish consumption and the superiority of the Nordic race. Well, here your inner Mikhail Bulgakov is speaking and having fun, I think.
Yes, I'm having fun with this line and with this character, but the sad fact is that he is absolutely based on my great-grandfather, who published a big essay in 2 parts in a journal in Iceland, and the essay is called Fish and Culture. And my great-grandfather is trying to prove that the Nordic race is the superior race because they eat so much fish. And the only people that are not of the Nordic race that he allows into the picture are, of course, the Japanese, who are far enough from Iceland to have the samurai culture and things like that. So he is completely obsessed with this link between eating fish and being the superior race on this earth. So he's talking about this throughout the whole book. Absolutely eccentric, but really full of deadly ideas. So in that case, I used comedy to present how ridiculous some of these arguments are. But peasant culture.
But in CoDex 1962, it becomes everything serious. It gets serious. So I read this book and I write down this. Thin eyes did see my substance is Michael Bulgakov, The Masters and Margarita, meets Gustav Meyrink, The Golem, meets Lawrence Stern's Tristram Shandy, meets Günter Grass, Tin the Drum, meets Bosch, meets Chagall, meets Bruno Schulz, The Street of Crocodiles, meets Mary Shelley, Frankenstein, meet Brothers Grimm, meet Italo Calvino, Cosmic Comics, meet Roberto Bolano, 2666, meet George Saunders, Lincoln in the Bardo, meets Kafka, Metamorphosis, meets Fritz Lang, M meets Karel Čapek, meets Don Quixote, meets Borges, meets David Cronenberg, meets Tarantino, meets Little Lord Paradise, meets Bible, meets God. Is this it? So you need basically a 1,000 page guide and a lot of patience if you want to connect all dots and get all allusions and all twists, like when you read James Joyce's Ulysses.
Thank you. I'm very glad to.
I will leave you
to hear this great party that is going on in the book with all these different elements.
It's crowded.
It's crowded. Yes. What can I say? Yes.
But saying all that, basically, it's a simple story. Boy meets girl, stranger comes to town. That's it. And that's the beauty of this.
You're right. The story, the basic story of the book is quite simple. Jewish refugee from the Holocaust, from the death camps, shows up in a guest house in northern Germany, carrying a hackcock with a lamp of clay. He is hidden there in a secret room in the guest house while they try to find a way to get him out of the continent, the dark continent of Europe. And a young chambermaid is asked to take care of him during the days he's there. And that is the story. That is the story. The stranger meets the girl there. And together they come together in the task of actually making the clay into a baby, by molding the clay into a baby. That is the story. But the person who is telling the story is the person who is created in the story. And that is Joseph Löwe, that we can call the son of Marie-Sophie, the chambermaid, and Leo Löwe, the Jew who is on the run.
Made by immaculate conception.
Yes, it's absolutely immaculate. And
she's not by coincidence named Marie.
No, okay. No, not by coincidence. There are no coincidences in a book like this. And that is the main story. And he's telling the story of how his parents met and how he came into the world. But he's telling the story to a listener, and that is what this book is. It is somewhere. The voice of the book is somewhere between the written text and the spoken text. It's almost an oral telling. He's telling a listener his story, how he came alive. And the listener is a difficult listener. The listener doesn't believe completely in the story. The listener has questions. The listener says sometimes, I've heard this before. And poor Joseph Löwe, to keep the listener listening, to keep his story interesting, to keep his story valuable or
Icelandic,
he starts using every trick ever used by a storyteller to keep his audience alert. And that's why he starts reaching into all these different directions. There are texts that resemble text from the Bible. Like I said earlier, lullabies, dirty jokes, folk stories, stories of creation, the big and the small, everything comes alive in the universe of this book. And that is how we are. That is how we live. Every person lives embraced by the universe.
Yeah, great. And the birth of this clay baby takes more than 20 years. And finally, it comes to life in the year 1962, the same year and the same day as you were born.
Yes. Obviously, this book was born of me.
Yeah.
In an immaculate conception.
Yeah. So if we cut to the bone, trilogy CoDex 1962 shows there is a link between nationalism, this fascist nationalism, and the end of the world. Am I right? Or am I right? If we cut to the bone. It's a spoiler, okay.
Yeah, we can spoil the ending of the third book of the three books. But what we can say is that at the same time the book is celebrating creation and storytelling, and there's a love letter to literature and the sharing of stories between people, that we are an animal that tells stories and enjoys stories and distributes stories, sometimes hides stories, but we discover stories, that there is maybe in us something that can at the same time it is creating and bringing things to life, can bring about the end of this world that we're living in. And that is, of course, the situation we are in today with the climate emergency. So the same elements that make us these wonderful creative creatures seem to be the elements that are calling upon us our destruction. And a big part of that is the hubris is hubris. And I will not put the blame entirely on the nationalist thought, but it plays a big role because it is always looking for ways of simplifying and purifying, let's say. So the world begins in this book and the world ends in this book, but it's also about the story that we are all experiencing, which is that we are somehow find ourselves in this world and we know that we will not be in it forever.
So it's about Genesis and catastrophe. Yeah?
Yes.
Okay, so it reminds me of Roald Dahl's short story Genesis and Catastrophe, where, remember where Austrian woman who has just given birth to a son is fearful that her child will die as all her previous children, but the doctor assures her that the baby is healthy and he will live. She's happy, we're happy, but then it is revealed her son is Adolf Hitler. Yeah. That was my association when I was reading your book, one of the associations. But did you know in 1994, when you started this trilogy, how it will end in more than 20 years later with this last chapter of trilogy?
I always knew that because it is Genesis, that it would end with that apocalypse. So there was no question about it, because that's the nature of stories like that. Mm. And the apocalypse is so fascinating, I think, because it seems that there were two things that the human being discovered. And it's amazing that we started discovering this, and that every culture on earth has this story. No matter how simple we think that culture is, Even a tribe of 80 people somewhere in the Amazonas has the story about the beginning of the world, the fact that at the beginning there was nothing. For me, it's mind-blowing that the human being ever came up on the idea that once there was nothing. It's a huge idea. But at the same time, every culture on earth has a story about apocalypse, that this will come to an end. And I have some theories about why we have this. Yeah. And they are based on William Burroughs' idea that the word, that language, is a virus from outer space that happened to this particular animal. And like every virus, the virus ends by killing its host. And this virus that we've had since we started talking and telling stories has been telling us from the beginning how it will end.
But still, it's better to die in apocalypse than on oncology. Huh? You said somewhere that what pushed you into writing this trilogy was the Balkan War. Can you tell me some more?
Well, I think definitely one of the big influences on this book, and the reason it somehow felt possible to write this book was what was happening in the Balkans. I had been in Prague in the summer of 1980, and that is where I made a contract with Rabbi Löwe, who created the original golem in the 16th century. I made a pact with the Rabbi Löwe at his grave in the old Jewish cemetery. I went to the old Jewish cemetery in Prague, probably June, July 1990, and I was just paying him a visit to honor him as the creator of the golem. And I saw that people were like writing little messages to the rabbi and putting them under stones on his tombstone, or putting them into cracks on his tombstones. And these were requests, because the rabbi is a very powerful person up there. And they were asking for help for different things. So I thought, okay, maybe I will do it too. And I had a small problem in my life at the time, which had to do with a girlfriend. It was, today I know it was not a big problem. And I wrote like a request to the rabbi, maybe you can solve this for me. And because I am a very well brought up boy from Reykjavik, the son of a single mother who took good care of me and told me how things work in this world, I promised to do something for him instead. And I promised him that I would bring his golem to Iceland. Yeah. So I put this on a piece of paper, put it on his grave, put a stone on the grave, and I leave. The day after he solved my problem, obviously. It was a very easy thing for him being the rabbi. If you create the golem, you can solve a problem like that for an Icelandic poet. And I was left with the task of bringing the golem to Iceland. And obviously the only way I felt the only way I could do it was through a story, by bringing our stories and our worlds together through a story. I obviously was also visiting places in Prague that had to do with the golem, and Gustav Meyrink and many of my literary heroes from Czech literary history. But on the last night I was in Prague, I sat with a group of people, and there was one of the people there was like had some connection with the foreign service, and I said, so how are things going to go? Are things just going to go well here, like in this part of the world, with the fall of the Soviet and the walls and this and that? And he said, well, I understand that you think it might go like that, and I think in some places it will be more or less okay. I think it will be more or less okay here in Czechoslovakia, as it was. But for example, I think things will go mad in the Balkans, because Yugoslavia, because of a speech this man, Milošević, who I had never heard the name before, gave recently or whatever, And then I went back to Iceland, and things started happening. And I realized that I actually knew nothing about this part of the world. I knew nothing about the history of this part of the world. And then the pictures started coming, and the stories started coming, and the news started coming. And I was working on creating this book, and I realized that maybe this story was happening now and not in the Second World War.
Yeah. So when I said that your trilogy shows that there is a link between nationalism and end of the world, I want to always also stress that nationalism always, and that I mean always, means the end of the world as we know it, and we saw that exactly in Balkan War.
Yeah.
What nationalism can do, it can end the world as we know it.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. But just one little snippet. CoDex 1962 to me sounds like a perfect novelization of verse from Bob Dylan's "It's All Right, Ma, I'm Only Bleeding." He's not busy being born, he's busy dying. That, I think, could be a copy line for your trilogy. Perfect. But Rio Löwe and Marie-Sophie, that couple from CoDex, look a lot like childish couple from Vladimir Johansson's Lamp, ultimate Christmas movie, by the way, for which you co-wrote screenplay. Was this meant as a companion piece to Thine Eyes Did See by Substance?
Well, I think Valdimar asked me to join him in making this film called Lamb because he had read my books, and he knew that I could possibly help him make the impossible real. And Lamb is about a couple of farmers living in north of Iceland in a remote valley who one day discover that one of their sheep has given a birth to a child with a lamb's head, or a creature that is a lad with a child's body. And they decide to keep it. Obviously, when farmers, when the sheep birth strange creatures, the strange creatures are killed right away. That is just how it works on a farm. You're not bringing freaks. But they decide to keep this strange little thing because, as we learn, they have lost a child themselves, and now they feel that the world is giving them a second chance. And obviously, as you can see in this book, I am occupied with stories about creations and creatures and how things come into the world. And that is why Valdimar asked me to join him. And the big trick in that film was to ground the experience in the emotional life and lived experience of the people, so that when you see the creature, you don't just laugh, It is a serious thing. And that's what Valdimar asked me to help him with. At the beginning, he just had postcards with pictures of people with babies, and he had put glued lamb's heads on the babies, And somehow I knew that we had to make this real. We had to make this real and felt and understood. That's how we worked. And then, obviously, a few years later, Robert Eggers came to me and asked me to join him on The Northman for the same reason. He had read one of my books called...
May I say something? Best Hamlet ever. Northman. Best Hamlet ever. No contest. No contest. No contest. But the lamp, I think, really cuts into our predicament. Obsession with kids and scary cuteness of parental exaggerations on one side, and denying women reproduction rights on the other side. And it shows, the superb message of this movie is that parental fantasies are never innocent.
Yeah.
Just
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, the film is really dealing with many of those things that you are mentioning, and the big tragedy in the film is that they take this creature from the mother's sheep, and I think apart from what you were mentioning, the film is also dealing with man's relationship with nature in a bigger context. You know, how we domesticate animals and take them and have total control over their lives, you know, and of their offspring. And then we forget that they are actually creatures that come from nature. And what happens if nature wants its baby back, you know? Yeah. And it's also about surrogacy, and it was amazing for us, you know, when we had the story and we started working on when we were preparing for the shooting of the film, we discovered how this very simple tale on the surface had all these layers. But that is the fun of making stories, of course.
Yeah, and also anxiety of adoption.
Yes.
But your novels are rather thin, all. Are you tempted to write a thick novel at 10,000 pages? Since we live in a time of, you know, Netflix series, long films. And by the way, Stephen King is feeding fans with very thick books. You know, he occupies them. They don't have time to read anything else. So he's killing competition. His readers will never come to you. So you should strike back.
Well, I don't know. This trilogy, this book, I don't know how many pages it is.
This is fat book. By your standards, this is thick book.
250 pages, something like that. You know?
But in Slovenia, in English,
it's a big book.
Yeah.
And
it is Bible.
Yeah,
Bible.
Yeah. Together, the three of them become 650 pages or something. So I made a big book, you know, out of three smaller books. But in general, I like to work with a small format, and I like to work condense things. And I think this comes from my beginning as a poet. And I think I'm the opposite of Stephen King. I realize that the people who read my books might actually need a part of their time for other things, like watching films and reading other writers and listening to music and maybe just going somewhere to have a coffee with their friends, you know. So Stephen King is like, you know, the ultimate, you're right, it's like the ultimate capitalist project, you know. He takes over, completely takes over your life, you know. But he's a good writer, and that's the problem.
He shouldn't be so needy, as his wife once told him. But when I said you should strike back, I mean, this shouldn't be hard, since your novels, even in this film form, are basically epics, all of them. Yeah. So you started with the poetry, you said, but are you writing your novels with metronome? Yeah. I mean, in songs, there's music and lyrics. Do you need to find the right melody for the novel?
What happened with this book is that I found my voice in this book. I found this way of working with text that lives somewhere in between the written text and the spoken word, you know. So to answer your question, I would say that I use breathing. It's very interesting that the human being is one of very few animals that can hold their breath. And obviously whales and seals can hold their breaths, but we are really the only land mammal that can control our breath. And that points to possible origins in this, and not on the savannas. Yeah, that's interesting. But we can hold our breath, and holding our breath and controlling our breath is what makes it possible for us to speak and sing. Because we have control over the flow of air from her lungs. And so what I use when I write is this, the control of breathing. Because the text lives somewhere between text and the spoken word, instead of a metronome, I have my breathing.
Why are all your novels placed in the past?
You know, I mean, you live here on the continent, you know, you live here on the continent of Europe. You know, in Iceland, 1264 is yesterday. And I would guess for you, like 3086 BC is yesterday. So is it really a past? You know, it's very close, you know. But seriously, one of the reasons I like to work with the past is that it gives me two opportunities. One opportunity is to go into a world and recreate a world that the reader most likely doesn't know. And that gives me an advantage. Because I always feel that if I'm writing about something that happened yesterday, the reader will be, no, it didn't happen like that. You know, it's, no, you got it wrong. There was a news program that, you know, was actually correcting this, you know. The reader immediately starts having an argument with you. But if you place the story in 1612 on the west coast of Iceland, very few people have any opinions on what things were like there, you know, and they just have to trust me. Another thing is that I really, and I think this comes from my experience and joy of reading from a very young age and to this day, reading texts from different time periods. So I like to go into in the different possibilities of the Icelandic language based on from what period, you know, I'm sourcing the material I recreate as a novel. So, for example, when I was writing From the Mouth of the Whale, that takes place in the early 17th century Iceland, I just loved being in the old texts, the way of thinking, the way they used the language, you know, and the metaphors they were creating. They were so strange, you know. And, yeah, and I was there with them.
You're right. The present many times looks like old age. And past looks like very, very contemporary. You know, yeah. But Moonstone is also placed in the past. Beautiful novel, I must say. This is the story of Manny Stein, a 16-year-old dyslexic jobless boy in 1980, 18 Reykjavik, that is struck with Spanish flu. But this boy is gay, he fucks for money, and he's obsessed with cinema. So his first film buff, first film gig in history of the world. Am I right?
I hope so.
Yeah. So the first film buff in history was gay. Beautifully. So it's I must add, it's logically because films are so gay and since forever.
You're absolutely right. I think you might know more about cinema than I do. So, you're right. One of the magic of cinema was from the beginning that you could be there in a crowd, in the dark, but still alone. And you could have your own relationship with what was going on the screen. And it is described in the book in an essay that a doctor writes where he's actually warning against cinema because he says cinema is so dangerous because people sit there and they look at the screen, they look at the actors, and they can make of the actors what they want. They can desire the actors in whatever manner they want. And he automatically links this with homosexuality. He says, they can sit there, boys can sit there and look at the man and desire them, It's a new space of experiencing yourself and your relationship with people, And this is obviously something that many gay film critics and scholars have showed us. And I based my book on that understanding.
Yeah, but incidentally, when I read Moonstone, it reminded me of Sisters Schmitz from Neukölln, who exactly the same year, in 1918, committed suicide famously because parents wouldn't let them go to the cinema. And it was reported in all newspapers in Europe, even in Slovenia. Slovenia, small town, for example, in Celje. This was probably with 10,000 or 5,000 people at the time. And this was reported everywhere. That was a shock. So your novel is based on true story. So this was Sjón. Thank you. And now questions. In Maribor yesterday, there was like tons of questions. So you can go over Maribor. You can show that this is capital. Da bi rekel, komu zdaj, a boš ti Jerca nosila to okrog? Sa zdaj mesta kepe nazaj? Oh, okay. Okay, dobro.
The only microphone in the city.
Yeah.
I would like to visit Iceland one day. And when should I visit it? Winter or summer?
Well, if you want the real Icelandic experience, you come in the winter, obviously. The darkest days are technically at the beginning. I like, leading up to the 21st of December, but it always feels darker in the weeks after. So I would say like fourth week of January, beginning of February. But the weather will be horrible, suicidal. I mean, it will be. You will survive by writing a poem.
Okay, I've got a question about this period of your government that you mentioned. So what were the activities of those people of surrealistic or what did you say? Yeah. Okay, what did you do? What was the reaction of the people? What was the atmosphere like? Things like that.
The amazing thing was that such a big part of the population of Reykjavik actually voted for this party. That was amazing. So this is 2010, 2 years after the financial crash. And it was very interesting, and I would say it's really touching, that the people of Reykjavik were ready to trust their city, which was almost on the verge of bankruptcy at the time, that they would trust it to people who came from the arts, and actually not only from the arts, that came from this former underground arts movement in Reykjavik. But they somehow sensed that maybe this is the right people to take us into the future and to correct what's going wrong in the city. So we had I think we had 35-6% of the vote, We had to go into a coalition with the Social Democrats, and we did that. But what the best party actually turned out to be was the biggest anti-corruption force ever in the history of Reykjavik, because we had no earlier ties to anything in the city and in the city structure and in the offices and in the departments and the companies that the city was the owner of and things like that. We could cut all the ties. So people who had, for political reasons, been put on boards of, let's say, the energy company and places like that, we could simply say, no, you're not going to be on the board anymore. We just got, and so what we did was that instead of putting political people on the boards of the companies, we put people who came from actually the field that the company was working in. So for the first time in the history of the energy company, the people on the board of the company knew something about energy production, you know. And so we cleaned up everything like that. And obviously people were happy with it. But we also came to it like people from the street. So we also from the beginning admitted that we didn't know anything about it. But we said, if they can do it, we can learn it. And in one of the first interviews with Sjón, the mayor, on television, he was being interviewed in the corridors, like somewhere in the corridors of the city hall, and he's asked a question about like some specifics about the budget of the city. And he's standing there and he just looks at the journalist and he said, you know, I really don't know. And somebody was walking past and he said, hey, come on here, hey, come on. And it was somebody from the financial department. And he said, come on. The journalist is asking about this. Can you maybe explain this to me? You know, so it completely changed the way people experience what a politician is, because politicians have become like their own specific class, and they keep power by creating the illusion that you need like almost like special abilities to be a politician. But what we showed was that people could come from another direction into running the city and making it work. So it put a lot of questions to the politicians. At the beginning, when the best party started rising in the polls, the politicians obviously didn't believe what was happening, especially the Conservative Party, the right-wing party, that has historically had always been the biggest party in Reykjavik until this happened. And the best party got more votes than the Conservative Party ever got. And I think, you know, one of the reasons the people of Reykjavik decided to trust this group with the keys to the city was that they knew these were artists, musicians, writers, comedians, you know. And what do you know about people like that? Or what did they suppose they knew about people like us? It was like to be successful in what they're doing, they have to be brave, they have to have integrity, and they know how to work on a low budget, because the arts never get any money. So they thought the city is going bankrupt, they will find a way of using what money there is, because they do it in their art all the time. So it was a very interesting process. And then the cynical politicians, they were always waiting for Sjón to turn into one of them, to be corrupted by the office. It was like they were just always waiting for the full moon, that he would turn into a werewolf, you know. And they told you so much about how they see themselves, that they believed that the power would corrupt him. And then what happened? So I finished the story about the best party, is that after 4 years in the city hall, the best party started polling like crazy again. It was leading up to the elections. And it started polling like crazy, and it looked like we would get even more votes than 4 years earlier. And then we did the only thing an anarcho-surrealist does and should do when a person like that comes into power. 4 weeks, maybe 5-6 weeks before the election, we liquidated the party. And we said, we're not going to run. And that was the biggest shock for the politicians, because they just couldn't believe that we would let go of power. And that was the big lesson from the anarcho-surrealists. You can get power, but you can also let go of power. And for a politician, that's unthinkable. So that was the big lesson. And so it had a big impact on Icelandic politics, I think, into the future, in the way people experience what politics can be.
Hello. I heard a joke about anarchists that their only problem is they can't organize. But you obviously could organize it. So kudos. You Icelanders are very strange in one way. You are, I think, the only country that managed to get the bankers to prison or something like that. And this is, I think, the unique thing in the modern world. That's question number one. Number two, the thing that comes after 2010 is the major populist movement from the right. How is the state of populist movement, this bad kind of populist movement in Iceland at the moment?
You're right. Quite a number of the big players in the field of economics and finance and banking actually were taken to task, and some of them went to prison, and most of them actually don't work in Iceland anymore, so they've taken their bad habits elsewhere. I just hope they haven't come here. There was we had all the signs of a populist movement coming into being in Iceland with a former prime minister who later had to resign because of the Panama Papers. And he had to resign because he started lying in an interview on television, and he was exposed. So there were massive protests outside the parliament, and he resigned. He was on his way to found a real populist party built on the center party called Framsóknarflokkurinn, which started as a farmers' cooperative party. But luckily, so far, we don't have a real populist party in Iceland. These tendencies, they went away with this guy. He's still in parliament, though, and still doing his stunts. But he lost all credibility. Obviously, he was voted back into parliament by his party followers. But so far, we don't have this. But and at the same time, we don't have any actual neo-Nazis. But the crazy thing in 2019 was that after I had delivered the manuscript for Red Milk, the book about the neo-Nazi, that autumn, all of a sudden, they just came out of the shadows. And I felt like almost responsible, that my book had somehow conjured them up. So for the first time in our history since the early 60s, we saw the swastika in the center of Reykjavik. And neo-Nazis from Scandinavia started coming to Iceland, and it looked like something was happening. But again, luckily, it fizzled out. So, but I don't think we are immune to it. And I think that there's big danger in thinking that this will not come to Iceland. There's a lot of people in Iceland ready for that message. Yeah. Please.
This question is kind of more serious than the one before. Is Iceland a textocentric culture? I know that for a fact that a lot of you write things, but I know that you're like a nation of artists. But is it something that puts text before other arts, meaning visual and audio arts, or is it just you do everything?
Historically, literature and writing is what survived through the ages, and through the centuries. we had a flourishing culture with music and visual arts and whatnot during the Catholic times, you know, from the settlement and throughout the Catholic period, which ended in the mid 16th century. With Reformation in Iceland came an absolute cultural poverty for a long time, and the only thing that survived then was writing, in one form or another, and oral delivery of poetry called rímur and other things like that. But you know, we have no cathedrals, we have no painting, you know, we have no symphonies, we have nothing until the 20th century. And that means that well into the 20th century, writing is the dominant form, and the poetry is the most respected of arts. But music started coming to Iceland, you know, slowly in the 20th century. One of the great lucks of the Icelanders is that in the Second World War and in the years leading up to the Second World War, musicians from the outside started coming. Some of them came as refugees, and you mentioned the Urbancic family, which was Viktor Urbancic, who came to Iceland with his wife Melita Urbancic and their 3 children from Vienna in I think late August 1938. So they just escaped before the big crackdown. And Viktor Urbancic and Robert Abraham Ottoson, another Jew who comes to Iceland, is classically trained and comes to Iceland to work in classical music. These people, they laid the foundation for Icelandic classical and contemporary music. So we owe everything to these people. And today, as you know, music is flourishing, and in the last two, 3 decades, I would say that visual arts, film, music has found its equal footing with literature, which is very sad for us, you know, because we lost our status, you know. Yeah, but it's still seen as, you know, great achievement to write a good poem.
I have a more general question on the role of the writer in Iceland, because we can relate on it, the curse of being a small country and the the small market. So what's the position of the writer apart from the big names, and the role of the writer is they can live off their work, and what's the attitude of people towards books and buying books, because here books are considered quite expensive. So what's the view of people in buying books and reading them in Iceland?
You know, we've been boasting of being the most literary nation on earth, you know, and I'm obviously boasting of being the most literary person on earth. You know, we've had a very flourishing literary community for a long time now. And the libraries are really play a big role in society, the bookstores, the publishing houses, the writers. But with the changing times, all of this is also changing, you know. And I would say that at the same time, the role of the writer, the role of literature in our self-image is still very strong. And we cherish our writers. We're glad to have our writers. We think it's important that people are using literature to, in a way, report on what it is to be alive on this island. That things are changing, you know. The number of copies sold is going down. The only people who really live by writing are the major crime writers, and large part of the readership is moving towards audiobooks, which is not necessarily a bad thing. That's just what is happening, and I think it's actually very interesting, being someone who's interested in oral storytelling, and I think we will, in the coming years, see writers who write specifically for the audiobooks and work with the format in a completely different way. So, you know, it's changing in Iceland like everywhere, but books are still have a very big place in society, and we have this thing that so many envy us of, which is the Christmas book flood, because the book is like the traditional Christmas present in Iceland. Everybody wants a book for Christmas, you know, and that means a big number of books is sold in the months leading up to Christmas. Everybody wants a book, at least one book that you can read on Christmas Eve, you know, when dinner is over. You retreat, you lie down in the bed, you know, and you read your Christmas book, you know. And that's a nice thing. I hope we will have that for a long time, you know. Yeah. So, one question there, yeah. So, one last question.
Last question.
Hi, hello. So it seems to me that in a lot of Icelandic books or films or TV, there's this merging of the real and the surreal and a lot of mythology. Can you tell a bit more about that? I mean, why do you think this is? Is it the influence of, I don't know, the sagas or geography or any other specific reasons?
Yeah.
You can give, you know, a surrealist answer.
Well, actually, I would say it's the only way we know how to do things. And one of the reasons is that, yes, the sagas are a format that is very much ingrained in us. And the amazing thing about the sagas is that on one hand, they are very realistic narratives where you only get to know what is going on through the actions and words spoken by people. In many ways, they resemble film scripts because it's only what is happening and what you hear that drives the story. But at the same time, people compose poetry in the sagas, you know, when things get like exciting, someone like says like, okay, let's define this moment here by a good poem. And in those poems, they are using a very complex system of metaphors called kenningar. And in kenningar, you're always bringing together the world of the gods and the world of man, you know, to try to understand really what's at the core of what is happening. And then once in a while, someone has a dream, you know, and that dream is an absolute part of the reality of that particular story. And then maybe a little bit later, you know, when things have become absolutely realistic, someone looks up and there's a writer in the sky, and the rain of blood drips from the hoofs of his horse, you know. So the real and the inner life and the manifestations of bigger realities is always there. And I think that you know, the novel came to Iceland relatively late. The novel came to the European bourgeois novel never came to Iceland. The novel comes to Iceland in let's say the second and the third decade of the 20th century. In the 20s and the 30s, the novel comes to Iceland. And what happens is that because we didn't have any bourgeoisie, we didn't have an elite to write about their problems, you know, people started working with this new literary technique called the novel, you know, and they did the only thing they knew, you know. When they told their stories, all of this had to come into them for them to somehow make sense. So what later became known as magic realism, when Gabriel García Márquez started doing the same thing Halldór Laxness had been doing in the 30s and the saga writers in the 1300s, you know, is the only way we can do it to make the story look real. Thank you so much. Thank you.